Hi, this is your lecture for November 23rd. We're going to be starting chapter 14 today, and we're going to be talking about Texas a lot, but basically this chapter is talking about expansion to the Pacific, or Manifest Destiny. Today we're covering pages 205 to 209. Okay, so in the United States in the 1800s, there was this push westward. There's always been a push westward from the earliest time that American colonists came to America to the current time that we're studying in the 1800s. And the reason for this, of course, has to do with a positive association that Americans had with national expansion, and it had to do also with this concept of manifest destiny, that it was America's right, it was America's privilege, it was America's duty to expand westward until she had expanded from sea to shining sea, or from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Southerners particularly were very interested in moving west, and this has to do for several reasons. One is they had crops that they were dependent upon growing, and they believed that more land meant more soil, which is a good thing, because the crops that they grew, like cotton and tobacco, rice and sugarcane, often had a strongly deplenishing effect on the soil, and so their soil that they had lost its fertility very quickly, and so they were always on the lookout for new land. So they thought that this was a very good thing, this idea of moving west. Also, it had to do with the issue of slavery. There's a very real possibility in the South's mind that if there was not enough lands to go around, then there was going to be the very new possibility that the free states would outnumber the slave states, and by that I mean that there would be more states who did not believe in slavery, who believed that slavery should be abolished, versus slave states who believed that slavery was fine, and that the free states would outvote the slave states in Congress. And so they liked the idea of there being more land available. And so many Southerners were interested in Texas. Now, Texas originally was a part of territory that belonged to Mexico. It was part of an area, Texas, New Mexico, and California. And so originally, these areas belonged to Mexico. And Mexico had actually just recently won its independence from Spain in 1821. Now, the Mexican government very much encouraged Americans to settle in Texas. And the Mexican government was not very stable. It was plagued by revolutions, and there was not a lot of loyalty to Mexico or the government in Texas because of the instability associated with the Mexican government, and also because of the tyranny associated with the Mexican government. But many Americans did migrate to Texas. One of the most famous grants given to an American by the Mexican government was given to Moses Austin, and he was given this huge tract of land on which he was going to have several hundred American families settle. But unfortunately for him, he died before he could complete this venture. And his son, Stephen Austin, had the grant conferred upon him. And Stephen Austin established a large American settlement in Texas. So by the early 1830s, some 20,000 Americans were living in Texas, and the American population far outnumbered the Mexican population. So there is tension between Americans and the Mexican government in Texas. And this really had to do with the Mexican government, putting harsh restrictions on Americans, because the Mexican government started to get the idea that by allowing Americans to come and settle in Texas, that they had jeopardized Mexican authority within Texas because there were so many Americans, and there was this fear that they would have allegiance to the American government versus the Mexican government. So Mexico put severe restrictions on the American settlers, including a regulation barring the importation of slaves. And Americans became very angry over, in Texas, Americans who settled and lived in Texas, became very angry over the fact that the Mexican authorities refused to hear their grievances, and they felt very targeted by the Mexican government. So blood was shed in several violent outbursts, and finally, by 1836, Texas was fighting a war for independence from the tyrannical Mexican government. And the Texas War for Independence was not a war of Americans versus Mexicans. It was really a battle of all the people living in Texas against what they considered to be a tyrannical government. So many Mexicans joined the Americans in the move for independence from the Mexican government. One of the most famous episodes from Texas's War for Independence, of course, comes with the battle at the Alamo. Remember, the Alamo is a famous battle cry from that war. And the war culminated under the leadership of two men, the Texas War for Independence. One was Sam Houston. He was the former governor of Tennessee and a close friend of Andrew Jackson, and the Texans followed his leadership, versus General Santa Anna, who was a Mexican dictator who was determined to crush the rebellion that was stirring in Texas. The Alamo is the most heroic and best remembered battle of the war. So, under the leadership of Colonel William Barrett Travis, the Texans were able to hold the Alamo for nearly 2 weeks before they were all mercilessly killed. And among those who died defending the Alamo was the famous Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. And so after this, there was after the fall of the Alamo, there was another massacre of about 300 Texans after they had surrendered by General Santa Anna, which caused a lot of people to be upset at the outrage and the bloodshed. And remember, the Alamo became, a battle cry for the Texans who were fighting in the war for their independence from the Mexican government. And it was something that they would say to give them more fervor and fire for their cause. Okay, so about a month later, after the Battle of the Alamo, there was the Battle of San Jacinto. And San Jacinto was a victory for the Texans, and it practically ended the war. Santa Anna is actually taken prisoner, and he signs an agreement in which he agrees to have his forces to retreat south of the Rio Grande River, and he's going to try and convince the government to recognize the independence of Texas. The Mexican government does not recognize Texas's independence, but nevertheless, Texans organize the Lone Star Republic, and they elect Sam Houston as the first president in the fall of 1836. So the question is, what do you do with Texas? So within a few weeks of Sam Houston becoming president of the Lone Star Republic, many of the Texans expressed a large interest in being annexed, and annexed means added to the United States. And many people in the U.S. thought that was a great idea. Particularly Southerners liked that because of the fact that they saw an opportunity of balancing political power between the North and the South. There would be land available for crops. Expansionists liked the idea because they believed that America was eventually supposed to expand all the way to the Pacific, so that would be on this side. So Atlantic to Pacific, expanding from sea to shining sea. And so they were for that idea. But there were also a lot of people who did not like the idea. A lot of people felt like it was political trouble to annex Texas. They felt like that if they did that, they would be basically asking Mexico to go to war with them. And so there was a lot of strife over what to do with Texas. And it was really postponed for a long time. The debate over what to do with Texas was postponed. And several presidents had to deal with the issue. So Jackson retired from office, and the only thing that he did was officially recognize Texas's independence. And it wasn't until President Tyler, who favored administration policy, who favored an administration policy that would add Texas. So the annexation of Texas was going to be one of those important debate points in the political realm, and actually plays a major role in the presidential election of 1844. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do is to please read about Davy Crockett. Remember, he's one of the famous fallen of the Battle of Alamo, but he was famous even before then. Read about him on page 208, and then I want you to complete the section review on page 209. Thank you.